Grace Lee Boggs' introduction to the book that we already read, just about the conclusion. We read the last chapter of this book, Evolution and Revolution. This was published in 1974 to begin with, but then it was republished in 2008. And Grace Lee Boggs, who by this time was like 93 years old, she wrote this at 93 years old. And I include it here near the end of the class as an example of the way that revolutionary thinking has changed, as demonstration that revolutionary activity still goes on, and as a final filling out of what we might be thinking about when we want to understand what power is today, what resistance might be today. And really, it would be really cool if one or two of you got the idea from this class that doing some kind of organizing, taking part in some kind of activity would be a good idea. Doing, like actually working together with other people in order to try and make little pockets exist that are different in kind from what we see the whole problem to be. That is like so, it's invigorating. One tremendous problem that we have is that we are so fundamentally passive. We're so fundamentally apathetic. And I don't believe that that's a character flaw on the part of the vast majority. I think that is a produced phenomenon. And as I said earlier, maybe that disinterest is actually reasonable in a way, because we know that power is actually totally out of our hands. I don't think that engaging with the internet and digital media and these perpetual media flows actually makes us more active. I think it makes us more passive. I think a fundamental problem is this profound passivity. You could puzzle forever about how can passivity be overcome. There's all kinds of philosophy that tries to answer this question. It's a deep and lingering question. It's almost unanswerable. But the beautiful fact is that all you have to do in order to stop being passive is to fucking do something. It's light, it's not heavy. It's not like there's this tremendous inertia that you have to overcome in order to start doing things. You can just start doing things. So it would be cool if you would get to the position where you'd start thinking, oh, maybe that's a good idea. And I think that Grace Lee Boggs gives like a great picture about what sorts of things might you do. And also maybe a picture that'll make some of you feel more comfortable, because she's not talking about the establishment of community defense groups, although that's something that I support. People who are trained to fight and use weapons if they need to in order to defend their communities. I mean, shit with the KKK around, that seems like a reasonable thing. But that's not what she's talking about. She's talking about building community groups. And I think she's right that this has to be the basis of what we do in the pursuit of what she and her late husband, James, called a new American revolution. And maybe that's a nice counterbalance to the new American century, which she mentions in her text here. That's a program of American imperialism. Let me first of all point out that Grace Lee Boggs is reaffirming a few of the things that we heard in the past lecture or two about the Zapatistas. For one, I've been pointing out that there's this sort of large-scale sea change in the way that revolution is thought about, and the sort of revolution that seems to be possible and that seems to be necessary. It's not just that the old Marxist-Leninist model, it's been shown to be impossible. It's also that it's undesirable. It's undesirable to organize workers into top-down directed groups where they basically become soldiers, where they take commands from on high, such that they can hypothetically move into a future situation where their leadership becomes the new government and they can continue to take commands from on high. Not only is that revolution apparently not going to happen, but we don't actually want it to happen. On the other hand, it looks like some other variety of revolution may well be possible. I would argue is absolutely essential. It looks possible and it is desirable. And the real difference is that the way that Grace Lee Boggs or the Zapatistas or the people in Rojava are thinking about revolution is that now they want to follow this model of anarchism, of direct action, of so-called prefigurative politics. Prefigurative means like, the best phrasing for that is from Gandhi. You know, you want to be the change you want to see in the world. That's prefigurative politics. So the recommendations for revolutionary organization, revolutionary training, revolutionary agitation, whatever it is, that are coming out of the Zapatistas and out of Rojava and from Grace Lee Boggs are all about establishing the community. She calls it the beloved community. That's something she takes from Martin Luther King, and it's the name of one of the groups she was involved with. Create the community that we are lacking, and then build on the basis of strengthened anti-capitalist communities to greater and greater power over communities, over our local situations, over cities, which may eventually erode state power. Of course, this does not disallow the idea, and this is much more explicitly given if you read Öcalan, who's the primary reference for the people in Rojava. He was a PKK, or is a PKK leader who read this libertarian anarchist named Murray Bookchin and got into it. In that case, it's much clearer. They're like, okay, we're trying to build a society independent of, in their case, Syrian state control, and we don't want to seek out a conflict with the state. But when the state interferes with local self-determination, we will have to defend ourselves. So she doesn't actually back off from her Black Power roots in this respect. She's still pretty damn hardcore, but she's also speaking a language of love, and she's centering traditionally female virtues, love and caring and nurturing and patience, at the same time that she holds on to this radical insistence that everything has got to change, and we've got to do it now. You know, we cannot wait. Anyway, so she makes a comment affirming that the old revolution is not the one that has to happen. It's like, well, you know, the proletariat can't do it. The working class, and Marx, it's always the working class, not the unemployed, not the lowest classes, not the poorest people, but the working class, the ones who receive wages, because they are the ones from whom profit is taken, but they are also the ones that Marx thought were in the positions to take over the economic apparatus. Grace Lee Boggs is like, no, that class is always shrinking. And of course, I talked in the previous lectures about precarity. We're less and less at one particular place. But she's got a really harsh attitude towards that. She's like, you know, the working class has just turned into a bunch of mindless and irresponsible consumers. That's what we are now. We're not a revolutionary class. You know, all of Marx and Lenin's hopes were based on the alleged integrity and courage and power and strength of the working class. And you can see that idealization manifested in, you know, Soviet-style socialist realism with all these big, chunky, muscular characters, imitated developed in the immediate aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, also by people like Diego Rivera. This heroicization of the worker from whom the power comes. And the Mexican Revolution is the worker, the peasant, and the soldier, the revolutionary triumvirate. If that was the case at one point, and perhaps it was, it is so no longer. Instead of having a group of like potentially revolutionary people, we have a bunch of couch potatoes. This class is no longer the hope for a revolution. It's a class that in large part is totally co-opted by ideology. It's totally blind to its own history. It consents to believe this like total bullshit about our wars and our economy and our political leaders because it doesn't care to do anything besides sit in front of the TV and think about buying stuff. Now, this is, of course, not necessarily true about any individual members of that class, and that's us too, right? We can transform ourselves, but this is Grace Lee Boggs' point. She's like, the revolution is going to have to begin with us transforming ourselves, not just with working people realizing that their shared interest is different from the interests of the boss, and on that basis forming unions which eventually get linked into some kind of, revolutionary leadership. No. That's not what's going to happen. Okay, she also, on multiple occasions in this introduction that she's written, refers multiple times to neoliberalism. She mostly refers to it as multinational capitalism, but I think it's basically the same thing. She mentions offshoring in particular, the moving of production out of the United States, and this is because I think she's centered in Detroit, and she's lived through the whole drama of Detroit. Its boom, its revolutionary period in the 1960s, and its bust, the pulling out by the major automakers of factories from Detroit, and the result, the consequence, like total urban decay. She's seen all of that stuff, and she understands that that is the result of the contemporary form of capitalism. And then lastly, I would like to point out that she is expressing explicit support for the Zapatistas and their form of participatory democracy, participatory government, and participatory community defense, and similarly for the anti-globalization movement. She refers specifically to this activist named Starhawk, who is really important for a whole bunch of people that I know, especially like feminist-oriented people, people in like women's organizing, and a lot of queer and trans folk really gravitate to Starhawk. Grace Lee Boggs mentioned Starhawk in particular, who was one of many activists involved around the anti-globalization movement in forming affinity groups. So that whole movement, 4 or 5 years of a whole lot of activity attempting to block, first of all, really, and then more like symbolically, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which are sort of these, they're not the center of global capitalism, but they're like the bureaucratic wing of global capitalism. All that organizing was carried out on explicitly anarchist lines. And what this meant was that in large part, I mean, there were unions involved too who use older models of organizing, but the activist groups were affinity groups. Affinity means, liking somebody. So an affinity group is a group of people who come together because they fit together somehow. They gravitate to one another, they have shared concerns, they learn to trust one another over time. That's the unit of anarchist organizing. Now, I talked previously about communes and popular societies. An affinity group is basically a non-territorially based commune. Within a good affinity group, all decisions should be made in a totally egalitarian style. Usually they're made on the basis of consensus, small enough groups that you just talk until everybody agrees. And if somebody really doesn't agree, you don't do whatever the thing is. You make sure everybody's comfortable. Radical anti-hierarchy should be no men who tend to talk over women, or if that exists, which is hard to get away from, there should be practices that stop that happening. We got to recognize it. Men have to recognize our habits of domination, which are sort of built into our gender roles. And then, of course, affinity groups operate in coalitions, and they get together for larger campaigns and stuff. So Grace Lee Boggs is explicitly affirming that form of organization. Now, the last thing that I want to add about her, I just have this big list that I took from notes. I don't think this is a hard text to read. I think it's it's like a marvelous resume that she's giving us, together with some fairly profound and I think quite heartfelt reflections upon Martin Luther King. As I said before, when she was younger, she was in the Black Power movement and thought that Martin Luther King was overly naive and overly soft. But here at the end of her life, at 93 years old, and after these decades and decades of serious, earnest community organizing work in Detroit, she starts to realize, no, Martin Luther King understood that the basis of the movement had to be love, and it had to be community. So I want to list off just this list that I made in reading, the principles, positions, and ideas that she recommends. And I thought that I would do a second section where I listed off the projects she actually did, but you can read that too. And the thing is, I think all the things that she thinks should be done, she's actually done them. She's been involved in doing them in all these different ways. So I'll sort of just bounce back and forth where I see fit between the new values. She wants what does she call it? A revolution in values. The new values and the new types of organizing projects she recommends, and the ones that she actually did. And the point, again, of this stuff is this is 2008. We're getting pretty close to the present. We can use these as models. Or at the very least, if any of you become interested in thinking about how to affect real change, how to combat neoliberalism, how to combat hierarchy and racism and the total disempowerment of communities. And I mean, worse is coming, We're going to run out of clean water. Lots of places are running out of clean water. The state is only getting stronger. No one has ever seen a surveillance apparatus like this in the history of the world. Things are going to get harder, but you can think about each one of these recommendations as a possibility for us. And because the range of them is so great, and none of them that she lists here are militant, this is a way to think about how to become active and how to start changing our environment and how to start building resistance, which doesn't immediately run you into the dead-end question of violence versus nonviolence and the possibility of revolution and the strength of the state. Okay, one more reminder comment before I just read off this list and call it quits for the day. Remember what I said about the Boggs' sort of idealist temperament. They understood that one of the key things that needs to happen towards revolutionary change is what they keep calling the projection of new ideas. That's a revolutionary function. In the old world, in the Marxist-Leninist world, we'd sort of be talking about propaganda. Here, what she's doing, and what I'm trying to do in teaching a class like this, is to throw this stuff at other people and just see, can we like bump you? Can we like shift your pattern a little bit? Can you shift your pattern a little bit? Can you not just look for your business degree? Can you not just like think about marketing? Can you maybe like think what marketing is? Think, where does the thing that you were planning on doing in your life fit into this overall system? And can you do something a little different? Maybe. Okay, so let's project some values. Number one, you should not see yourself as a victim. Or as James Boggs put it, you should not think like an underling. Even identifying as a member of an oppressed class and thinking of yourself in terms of that oppression from the perspective of the Boggses, that's self-defeating. There's this whole big problem about being passive versus being active, and the primary problem with being a victim or thinking like an underling, somebody who needs to take orders from elsewhere, is that those occupying that social role precludes your taking action yourself, making decisions yourself. And there's no such thing as self-government without taking action yourself. Go back and check out the first text from Hannah Arendt about this stuff. What she really thinks we ought to be doing is forming all these different community organizations, wherever we are, at our school, in our neighborhood, at our place of work. And this is totally what I'm for. Form councils, form groups. Make these groups be egalitarian, disallow hierarchy within them, make sure that they make decisions in a democratic way. And within these groups, we need to practice new varieties of loving relationships. This is what she says. We need to learn how to reintegrate ourselves with other people in a respectful way, in a productive way, in a powerful way, not a hierarchical way. When men interact with women, we need to practice not dominating, and especially not dominating in all the little thoughtless ways that we tend to dominate, just by speaking more loudly, just by crowding more space. We need to practice new relationships to one another, and we need to practice new relationships to the environment. Now, there is a way in which Grace Lee Boggs' text is profoundly feminist. She is endorsing these traditionally feminine tendencies, loving, caring, nurturing. This is what she wants. But at the same time, I was talking to my wife about this earlier. She really loves Grace Lee Boggs, and she's like, it's the way that she matches that deep tenderness with like a total badassness. She's very solid, very forceful individual. This is sort of what she's trying to model, what she thinks we could be. She's convinced that we need to rid ourselves of capitalist values. That means we need to throw away our ideas about individual success, where we lift ourselves up above others, about the value of the individual compared to the value of the community. We need to really question that one. And I'm with her on that, because I don't think there is much value to the individual when the individual is removed from the community. Only within a real loving community, within a real honest functioning community, can the individual be recognized and be respected. At the bottom level, and this is like part of a lot of the projects that she actually started, the first thing that we need to do is get together with other people and share stories. And ideally, here's where maybe she differs with some of the anarchist organizing or the other types of organizations like the IWW, say, that exist today. If you get together because you all share an ideological perspective, maybe you're not going to become educated enough in that group. This is one of the values of doing like real community organizing, where the group that you're trying to put together is just geographically rooted. Now, of course, we know that segregation happens in our city, and it is geographically rooted, so this doesn't guarantee things. But if in your neighborhood you invite really everybody who's there, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of different perspectives. And just getting people together, buying them, like pitching in to buy a few pizzas, or like bringing food, these like simple, loving, almost church-like, although without the God and without the religion and without the hierarchy, gestures, welcoming people, we can begin to transform ourselves. This is real change. What's not change is to just sit in front of your television all the time, or at your computer, or in your car, which is mostly what we do. Get together and share stories. We want transformation. We're shooting for transformation. And elsewhere she talks about two-sided transformation. This is what she thinks, one key thing she thinks can be derived from Martin Luther King. She says his was the first movement which aimed at two-sided transformation, meaning both the transformation of selves and the transformation of the environment. Probably if you asked her, she'd back that off and say, okay, oh yeah, that was there in Gandhi too. What in Gandhi and Martin Luther King gets called spiritual practice. The kind of discipline that Martin Luther King told us in the letter from Birmingham jail is necessary for people to do nonviolent action. That's work on the self. That's work on, how we are and how we live. It's work on our own values. It's work on our own habits. We have to do that kind of work. But we can't do only that kind of work, because if we only do that kind of work, we might as well just be a bunch of, Silver Lake bourgeois attending a yoga retreat. We also have to be aimed at changing the environment so that it's less polluted and all that, but more the general political, economic structure that surrounds us. And more concretely, say the schools that our kids go to. We need to be involved in changing those schools in the right way, because right now those schools produce individualistic, success-seeking, isolated, capitalist-friendly, submissive workers. By the way, that's how I think that I'm involved in evil. That's what education does for the dominant system. It makes submissive workers. So we need to be involved in education, either setting up educational scenarios ourselves or just pushing ourselves into neighborhood schools and pushing for the teaching of real history, for example, but also the teaching and the practice of real gender equity. We need to be involved in these kinds of transformations of real patterns of life, of our real patterns of sociability. Early on, the Boggses had the idea, I'm just moving down my list here, so I'm sorry if this is scattered. They had the idea that a new American revolution, which in 2008 she still believes needs to happen, could be led primarily by black people because of their historical position. She no longer believes that. It has to be multi-ethnic, has to be multi-gendered, has to be decentralized. We don't want organizations with central hubs where decisions are made, because that produces hierarchy, and out at anywhere except for the center, it produces apathy. It produces passivity. Any specialization of the decision-making function will result in the weakening of decision-making capacities, atrophy. Any strengthening of decision-making function at a central location will result in the atrophy of decision-making function in the majority of the members, even of a given organization. So we have to be decentralized. There has to be a balance between action and reflection. We have to be seriously involved in organizing campaigns, but we also have to be seriously involved in thinking through what it is that we ought to be doing, thinking through our history, thinking through the power dynamics that surround us, thinking about how black people and white people, Latino people and Korean people, how older people and younger people, grown-up people and children, we have to analyze power relationships. We have to analyze how power is working. We have to analyze how the cops are working. We have to think through, what do we really think about police shootings? What dynamic is that problem a part of in a larger scale? How does our educational situation fit into this overall power dynamic? Because it certainly does. Education is a key means by which people are integrated into the capitalist system. We have to, on the one hand, be engaged in organizing, and on the other hand, be engaged in trying to think this shit through. What they want is a self-governing America. You can say, if you go read Hannah Arendt writing about Thomas Jefferson, there definitely were members of the original American revolutionary movement who wanted fairly radical local self-government, but they were few. Thomas Jefferson is the most famous one. That's the kind of self-government she wants. Not self-government where the state governs itself, but self-government where each community governs itself. And now here's a place where she makes recommendations, but these are also things that she has done. She has been directly involved with in Detroit. She wants to form all kinds of community committees. So here are examples that she lists. Committees for crime prevention. Committees to take over abandoned houses, and this is especially pressing in a place like Detroit. Take over abandoned houses, refurb them, use them for people who need them, according to specifications made by the community itself. Family circle committees to help people to deal with what happens with their kids in schools and on the streets with gangs and with drugs. Committees to take over schools, to insist that the community determine the direction that schools take. I mean, in our case, I think a large movement like that would probably have to push against standardized testing. You can become a good student by memorizing shit and barfing it back up again. And then you forget it 6 months later, but your education has allegedly taken place. I beg to differ. No fucking education took place. Perhaps indoctrination took place, but mostly what happened was the practice of repeating what you were told by an authority to an authority. It's a practice of authoritarianism. Let's not have that. What if we have education which involves people learning to think, learning to connect one thing with another, learning to connect what they're studying, like a history, with their environment? Let's push for better education. Committees to resist utility company cutoffs, which she says, these are nominally city services, but really what's happening is that private entities are making use of this public service, this neoliberal phenomenon. Committees to take over closed plants. Now here's where things are getting more revolutionary, and you can see her kind of radical pedigree here. That's democratization or autonomization, not exactly nationalization, because that means that the state takes over some previously private resource, but it's local takeover. And especially in a place like Detroit, you have there's all this means of production, including just raw space, which we're prevented from accessing, but why? So she is recommending things that have traditionally been sort of anarchist models. It's direct action. Every one of these things is direct action. You're going to do it yourself. You're not going to beg your representative, your congressperson, to do it. You're going to do it yourself. There should be anti-nuclear movements, committees to oppose nukes. And then she lists off some of the things that they did during Detroit summer. This is early 1990s. They set up community gardens. She's really into gardens because in that case she says, okay, so if you put gardens in inner city places and you let everybody work on them, you produce healthy food, which may not exist there otherwise. You produce a sort of respect for nature, which doesn't exist otherwise. And you also give youth, especially youth, but not just, people in the inner city a sense of process, which if you go back and think about, James Baldwin or something, that's the problem of the ghetto. It's feeling fucking stuck, feeling like nothing ever changes and ever will. Simple little projects like building a community garden allows people to see how their efforts make a change and how their efforts fit together with natural processes of change. Rehabilitating houses, making public murals, cleaning up parks, setting up dialogues for intergenerational conversation, and within the youth in particular. The values, I'm going to wrap up now. I mean, you get the idea. You can go read the text, right? These are suggestions about how you might think about revolution on a local scale, on a doable scale. And they're also demonstrations of how we've sort of rethought what revolution needs to be. This is not to say that revolution should only be a neighborhood garden. Like these bigger ones, taking over plants or taking over abandoned houses, clearly those are things that should be done in the interests of a community, right? Why should empty space just sit there when people have to live on the street? That's bullshit. It seems to me ethical for a given community to do that, but that also puts the interests of the community in direct conflict, again, with private property rights. And so she's still against these private property rights. She's still against. What are the goals? Small neighborhoods, public transportation, urban agriculture, the establishment of open spaces, not car spaces, but walkable spaces that are friendly to kids, the reinvention of what work is and what work is like, largely working in ways that actually produce good in the world, and where the work of individuals or the work of a group of individuals is determined by themselves. We should reinvent education. She said specifically, education should be about and it should be practice in two-sided transformation. The transformation of the self and the transformation of the environment. That means that education has to involve young people being involved in actually doing things, not just sitting there and swallowing this story about fucking Christopher Columbus. We should build co-ops. We should pursue restorative instead of punitive justice. That means that, on a community basis, people sit down and they talk together about how certain infractions, a theft, for example, can be overcome, so that the person who stole whatever doesn't have their whole life trashed by being thrown in jail. And the community is not bolstering the prison industrial complex by throwing one and another really environmentally deprived person into that system. So, well, there you go. There's Grace Lee Boggs and some shit to think about.